James, it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you. I think Everything Must Go is a fantastic book for all sorts of reasons. One of the concerns that I've had is the response to the book amongst your fellow philosophers has been to focus on your criticism of analytical metaphysics. Now, as a doctor, I don't have a dog in this fight, so I would very much like us to focus particularly on the theses that you put forward in Everything Must Go.
The positive theses.
The positive theses, absolutely.
So I think the most important positive thesis is not original to the book at all. It's something like naturalism. Mm-hmm. The claim that philosophical knowledge, philosophical theorizing about the objective nature of reality should be closely linked to science, and furthermore that there's a particular activity which is not the province of any one of the sciences, namely the integration of science, saying something about what the world is like given that we have all the sciences we have. People often think that we're saying what's the world like given that we have physics. We're not. We are in part doing that, but we're also trying to say what's the world like given that we have economics and behavioural science and evolutionary biology and the whole panoply of successful sciences that we have. Now, that's a broad methodological thesis, and what we try to do is construct a metaphysics on the basis of that methodology, and the key features of that metaphysics, whether or not this is just a wish list, I leave it for others to decide, are one, a kind of egalitarianism about ontology. So the idea that the entities and properties and laws and causal structures of the special sciences are ontologically on a par with those of physics. The second claim is something like what exists is scale relative. So by that I mean that over very, very small time and length scales, ordinary material objects don't exist. The phenomena are not tracked at that scale by talking about those things. At very long length scales and very long time scales, again, ordinary physical objects don't exist. So whilst we accept the existence of entities from throughout the sciences, we think that in certain domains, in certain regimes, it makes no sense to talk about some things existing.
I mean, perhaps I could pick up on that, because a sense that, to me, touches on one of the ambivalences in the book, because the title, Everything Must Go, takes its cue from the fact that at the quantum level, there are no self-identical objects. Basically, there are fields, relations, and the individual relata, etc., don't exist. However, your scale-relative ontology is much more democratic. However, you speak of the primacy of physics, which suggests that ultimately physics is the final goal of understanding, the vanishing point of understanding, if you like. So there is an ambivalence there between your democratic ontology and actually the primacy of physics, which actually says everything must go.
Yeah, well, maybe there's a tension. I think we're clear, we try to be clear that we don't think that physics is primary in the sense of physics is ontology being the one true ontology. Mm-hmm. We do think there's a weak kind of primacy to physics in the sense that physics constrains everything else in a way that everything else doesn't constrain physics. Mm-hmm. So biological processes are limited to those that are compatible with physical law. Mm-hmm. Physical processes aren't limited to those that are compatible with biological law. So the asymmetry is more at the level of the possibility and necessity and causation and law than it is at the level of existence. I don't think that physics is finished. So physics isn't in a position to tell us the final list of its ultimate entities. Now, it may produce us such a list, but it seems to me it's an open question whether it ever will.
Yes, and as you make that very clear, that it's unfinished business. But what do you think is the status of medium-sized dry goods, to use Austin's phrase about the typical objects that metaphysicians think of? Medium-sized dry goods like yourself, or dryish goods. And what is the status? In the book, it looks as if you say that we imagine or think or populate our worlds with such items for evolutionary reasons, that's how we can negotiate the world. But of course, that presupposes the theory of evolution, which itself presupposes medium-sized dry goods, etc., etc. So in many ways, your explanation as to why we see these kinds of things, which do not appear to have the same ontological standing as the items or non-items at quantum mechanical level, your explanation suggests that in fact they are not real. So there's,
I disagree about that. So I think that
right.
we think that we talk about medium-sized dry goods because they're real patterns in the world, which is to say, the causal structure of the world is expressible at a level of description that involves talking about those things, that doing so is more efficient than talking only about fundamental physical entities, and more accurate than quantifying over imaginary things or arbitrary concatenations of everyday medium-sized dry goods. So I think our view is really quite straightforward. I mean, we talk about tables because there are tables. And what does it mean for there to be tables? Well, it means that in a theory of the world at a certain scale, if you want to capture the causal regularities in how things behave, you quantify over tables, you're successful in doing so. That is to say something like there are causal laws and regularities statable in terms of those things.
That sounds a bit instrumentalist.
Yes, I think it would be if there was any contrast class.
Right.
But we don't have one in mind, so we just think this goes for ontology across the board. So I think a lot of people would think that what we're doing is conflating epistemology with ontology. They'd say something like, well, you're talking about what you pretend exists in order to keep track of things, or what you pretend exists in order to describe the world for convenience sake. And what we say is, no, the world determines what things you can describe it with more conveniently than not.
Right.
It's not, you don't get to decide. So it's not subjectivist or relativist. And then secondly, what else would it be for a thing to exist than for it to be indispensable in tracking the causal regularity of the world at some level of description? Yeah. What's the contrast? What do you have in mind? Now, I think philosophers have often had in mind some kind of ultimate existence, some kind of existence in capital letters. Well, since we don't have any idea of what those such things might be, nor do they play any role in our lives, we shouldn't take that idea to be the true extension of everyday talk about what exists. What we mark by the term exists is the difference between tables and unicorns, the difference between planets and vital forces. Some things turned out to be indispensable in our best theories of the world, and other things haven't. And the things the former things are the ones that we should count as existing.
And in relation to that, you mentioned real patterns, which is a very important notion, obviously central to the book, which comes from Dennett. And I just wonder if you could summarise what you mean by real patterns, because I have some worries about the notion. When I read Dennett's paper first time round, I couldn't understand what the fuss was about. But
right.
Perhaps, yeah.
Well, I think Dennett has a striking idea, but as he expresses it, it's a bit unclear whether he is being an instrumentalist or a realist. And Don Ross, the co-author of Everything Must Go, had, before the book, developed Dennett's ideas in a paper called Rainforest Realism. And that's essentially where we get that part of our view from. Well, I mean, the theory of real patterns is informally expressed by what I was just saying, really. There's sort of two idioms that you can use to, at least two idioms that you can use to express the idea. One is the idiom of information theory. So I can say, by analogy with the game of life, Conway's game of life, if I talk about patterns as higher order structures in a more basic structure, I may be able to express the dynamics of the structure at the higher level more efficiently than just by talking about the lower level entities. And so a classic example, I think, is something like the theory of ideal gases, where there are 10 to the 23 odd degrees of freedom in a description of the particles that make up the gas in this room. But if I describe the gas in terms of the concept gas and pressure, volume, temperature, I get a good handle on the behaviour of the gas, whilst it being an approximate description, whilst it not being one from which I can recover the behaviour of the particles individually. I can recover their behaviour on aggregate. I can recover statistical facts about them. And I do this at a massive reduction of computational cost.
So, yes, and in many ways, one of the key notions of that of algorithmic compression.
Something like that, yes.
Which is one that I find interesting. But the reason Dennett's paper worried me, and the reason your use of it worried me, was there is, as it were, in the starter pack you have, various things are taken for granted which don't actually fit into your ontology. There are perspectives, the notions of computational efficiency, the notion of information. Information is a term that I think is used very promiscuously to pretty well encompass any event. Now, without those kind of things that are external to the patterns to make one decide whether this is a real pattern or not, you really can't deliver what you want to do through the real pattern approach to get your rainforest realism. In other words, what is missing and what's being marginalized is a perspective, an observer, something out with the ontology you're describing.
That's very interesting and astute observation. I think essentially you're right that the notion of a perspective and the notion of an agent engaged in trying to predict and explain the phenomena is a key ingredient of our view.
I mean, just take the example of the bitmap in Conway's, what makes bits, what divides the world into bits, and then if you take the next level, which is spaceships and so on and so forth, again, it is a question of perspectives. One that divides the world into bits in the first place, the other then builds those bits together into things that have properties that are quite different from those of bits.
Right. So we do say that the bitmap game of life analogy is a potentially misleading one, because there is definitely a privileged level of description in that case, which is the bitmap, and that is the ultimate level of description. That is really where the action is.
It's only a privileged level of description because that's a human artifact.
Indeed.
And
that's right. So the question is, how do you transfer this theory to a world where you don't assume, in fact you go out of your way to say there's no privileged level of description, or might not be. And about that, I think I can say only what we try to do is really pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So, okay, to go back to my earlier example, we have the level of description at which there's the molecules of the gas. We have the level of description where there's the gas with pressure, volume and temperature. Now, suppose you say to me, right, but you've given an analysis of the gas as a real pattern in terms of these molecules. What about those? Then I say, they're real patterns too. And when you say, what do you mean? And I say, well, they're real patterns with respect to the subatomic level of description. With respect to that level, they're idealizations and hypostasizations of reality too. They're approximate. There are no molecules at the more basic physical level. They're emergent entities as well. What is it for them to exist? Well, for there to be an emergent level of description at the molecular level relative to that lower level. Mm-hmm. Now then you say, well, what about that lower level then? And I say, I don't know. That's a real pattern with respect to with respect to the phenomena, with respect to some more basic level of description we might have or be striving towards. And where does this end? Well, it may not end. So really, if you couldn't be satisfied with a story where there was a degree of circularity, then we won't be able to help you, because we don't. Precisely what we reject is the idea of fundamental building blocks of reality being the right way to think about things. Well, what I would say is that, I mean, you raise a lot of interesting points. So the other thing you said was about information. So I was saying before that there's two primary idioms in which we can express the theory of real patterns, and one is in information theoretic terms, but the other isn't just in terms of dynamics. We could, as a physicist, you could say, well, it just turns out that in this very high dimensional state space, there's an emergent dynamics at a much lower level of much lower dimensionality.
Even if
and that's an equivalent way of thinking about real patterns.
If you retreat from information to dynamics, I think you've still got the problem of levels of description.
Mm-hmm.
Levels, descriptions. You've got the problem when you talk about scale relative ontologies. Mm-hmm. Where does the scale come from? What applies to scale? I know this is being terribly literal-minded, but I think
these are good questions.
There's something being smuggled into the ontology.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So,
in order to create the ontology, in a way.
Yes, I agree. Well, so first of all, I don't think we should take the idea of levels too literally. I mean, the reality doesn't come carved up into levels. This is a way of thinking which is useful up to a point.
Of course.
So I certainly wouldn't think there's something like the biological level and then the chemical level. No. It's much more complicated than that, and levels cross-cut. We shouldn't think of reality as sort of stratified.
Yeah,
it's a useful metaphor up to a point.
Yes.
I mean, we clearly can think in terms of let's say we could think about the brain at the level of neurons, and that's different to thinking about the brain at the level of quantum field theory. I mean, so to some extent we could say there are levels. Now,
are there levels in the absence of conscious beings? In other words, were there any levels?
No, I think not. I think level is the idea of a level goes with the idea of a conceptual scheme that's used for keeping track of the world at some scale. Now, when you say, where do the scales come from? Well, look, I don't know. Do I think that the world sort of fundamentally resolves into scale of distance? Well, maybe not. Maybe space and time are themselves emergent. I really have no idea about that.
We're not talking about space and time, we're talking about observers being located in space and time, which is part of your starter pack, I think.
Yeah, okay, I think that's right. So we take it that there could be an agent at some scale in some domain wanting to keep track of the phenomena, and then what we say is basically what's real is what that agent needs to keep track of if they want to do a better rather than worse job of keeping track of the phenomena. And so existence here is something of a vague matter. I mean, we're always making trade-offs between scope and strength and simplicity. Yeah. So you could quantify over tables, but you could also, concern yourself with the different types of wood that tables are made of. With the, you could keep track of animals at the level of species, or you can keep track of them at the level of genus, or you could keep track of them at the level of individuals, and every proceeding to a different way of keeping track of things involves ignoring some aspects and focusing on others. So we all know that if I talk about things at the level of kinds, I lose sight of individual difference.
Yeah.
Individual difference matters, it's real, but for many purposes, it's irrelevant.
I don't think that's what we're disagreeing about.
No, we're not. I mean, so what I think what you would say is, yeah, that's all fine, but that's all kind of pragmatic. It's all epistemological. And I'm saying, no, that just is. That's just it for what's real.
Mm-hmm.
What else is there? Now, then you're maybe worrying about the extent to which this will be a kind of foundational ontology, because built into it is the idea of some kind of agent or observer or subject with a perspective, situated in the world, trying to describe it.
Armed with measuring instruments, armed with discourses, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, in our case, armed with an evolutionary endowed predisposition to pick out certain things as real.
Picked out by medium-sized dry goods like ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think we don't say anything about how one would reduce the notion of an agent or observer or perspective on the world. Mm-hmm. So in a sense it's a sort of, bit of a transcendental presupposition of the picture, which is probably why the last chapter is called Why Isn't This Kant?
Well, exactly.
It's not a million miles away from that way of thinking.
Yes.
That we start with the problematic of human knowledge, science. We find ourselves in the world talking about some things as existing, wanting to understand how existence of different kinds relate, and we really do, I guess, take that as our starting point. The starting point of an agent with a perspective, trying to keep track of the world.
Sorry, are we going to be in here until 10:30?
Yeah. You still my keys in the library though.
At 10:30 I was told.
Reopen at 10, yeah. You do open at 10 though, because we need to be able to set up the computer.
I don't know what to say. I mean, I was told if we were out by 10:30 that was fine.
Okay, we'll go over the road.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not quite sure if you nailed the point about
when you create a bitmap of something, that it does involve dividing the world into bits.
Yeah.
And you answered that question by saying, oh, well, atoms are real patterns, and then atoms are composed of real patterns at a low level and low level and low level. But how do you smuggle
Where does that all get
bits
started?
in there?
Well, I don't think there literally are bits or anything. I mean, what I was saying is...
But does it presuppose a sort of computational observer?
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
Okay.
It presupposes that what you want to do is predict and explain the phenomena. And that is a computational problem, if you like. I mean, I'm not saying that means you are a computer or something. I mean, I'm just saying that in a loose sense and informally, I mean, that's a computational problem, right? You're trying to find patterns, and then among the patterns, you're trying to work out which ones are projectable and which ones are merely accidental. And which ones do I rely upon? So, if I come here next week at 9 o'clock, you won't be here. They will, right? So that's the challenge, right? How do I spot which is... Now, I've got enough background knowledge to have already worked out, all right, they're the librarians, they always come in. I know that we're here because we just arranged it on an ad hoc basis. So, but, just thrown into the world, well, you'd just be looking around with no grip on anything, right? But we don't, whilst in the tradition of sort of Western philosophy, we would have imagined that we are just these raw agents who find ourselves situated and then engage in some kind of Cartesian examination of what we know and where our concepts come from. But in reality, we're not. We're agents with a huge evolutionary endowed set of concepts, and we already know, we're already pre-programmed to pick out certain kinds of things as salient. Medium-sized dry goods, right? I mean, we know experiments with children that babies at very small age will be very surprised if they see two objects go behind a screen and one object come out the other side, and they tune in, right? And because their cognition is already set up to be like track things in terms of rigid bodies moving around and pay attention when that kind of thing goes awry, because that's interesting. That's something you've got to learn from.
It's got its folk ontology in place.
In a sense. Yeah. So I think that's the point. I think we can't look for a kind of philosophical a priori or philosophical reconstruction of our everyday ontology, because our everyday ontology is a mixture of our cultural endowment, but to a large extent it's just there in our biological endowment. We're highly complex beings, and millions of years of evolution have determined that we will track things in certain ways, whereas a bacterium, well, it just has the gradient of sodium concentration in the environment, and it perceives it and goes up the gradient or down the gradient or whatever. There's a much more rudimentary level of of identifying real patterns. Even that one is actually incredibly complicated and sophisticated compared to
stone falling down a hill.
A stone falling down a hill.
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the crucial thing then one might say is, well, the difference with the stone falling down the hill is the stone falling down the hill doesn't have any kind of internal representation of the external world, and it doesn't have any kind of telos. Now the bacterium, and we do, where does that come from? Well, that comes from our being living beings, right? Now, well, that's just to restate it, right? So how do we naturalize that? Well,
I think I can see now one of the things that worries me, which is, in a sense, you're faced with explaining folk ontology. And what you're trying to do is three things at once. It seems to me, one is to account for the ontology and to give it some basis in science. The second is to account for why we have a different ontology from that which is seen in the scientific image.
yeah.
And also trying to account for the folk as well. In other words, that which underpins or necessitates that kind of ontology. And I think it's having those three goals simultaneously. I think that's what made me a bit uncomfortable about the whole real patterns, or the dependence on real patterns, or its central role it plays in your book. I suspect I'm even more muddled than it sounds in what I'm saying. But that was my anxiety. But I just wondered, the camera's rolling, by the way.
Yeah.
Coming on to structural realism, which is very much associated with yourself and your co-writers. It seems to me it has two parents. One is dealing with the no miracles explanation of science. The only way to explain the success of science is it must actually capture some reality. It can't be an entire human construct.
Right.
So you're realistic about science, but you recognise that scientific theories are evolving and changing all the time.
Right.
So something must be conserved over time as you move from one theory to the next. That's your sort of meta-induction, as it were. And it seems to me that what is conserved, according to your book and according to others, is a structure. And in fact, it's a mathematical structure. And the examples you give in your book are mathematical structures that are conserved as we move from pre-Einsteinian mechanics to Einsteinian mechanics and so on. So the thing that is preserved is a structure. So that's why you're a structural realist about science. I guess you're an ontic structural realist well, there's another thing that feeds in, which is quantum mechanics,
Yes.
which is to which you do give a primacy in some sense, and it's the ontic bit that you get from quantum mechanics. The notion that we really do have a handle on the kind of things there are, and at one very basic and very important and perhaps primary level, the kind of things there are not things at all. They are relations, mathematical structures, relations without relator, and so on. So you've got these two parents, and already they seem a bit mismatched. One is from the history of science, and the other is from a particular state of a particular scientific theory.
Yes.
So I found that an odd marriage.
Good. Let's be careful. So we don't say there are relations without relator. What we say is that the relator themselves turn out to be relational structures.
Yep, it's relations all the way down.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Next point is we have no choice but to try to articulate metaphysics from where we are. Yet we know that we may come to radically rethink things in the future. Kant says in the Prolegomena something like, to think that we'll stop doing metaphysics because, roughly speaking, we can't get it right, is to think we'll give up breathing because we can only breathe in pure air. We just take ourselves to have to try to articulate a metaphysical view, and then all we can do is do the best that we can given what we know now, whilst recognising that that may well turn out to be importantly wrong in various respects. So I agree with you, there's a kind of paradox, right? On the one hand we're saying the ontology of science changes over time, on the other hand we're saying we should take cues in ontology from quantum mechanics. I think what really goes on in our thinking is a kind of consilience argument, which basically says there are all sorts of problems that you get into in ontology, in the interpretation of science, when you think about the world in terms of some ultimate set of self-subsistent individual things. That there's no good reason to think the world is like that we get that by projecting from the way we think about ordinary medium-sized dry goods, and that given that there's no good reason to keep hold of that idea, we should abandon it and think about things in a different way. Now, what is that different way? Well, you said we think there are mathematical structures, and I think, well, yes, but it's a little bit more subtle than that. I think we would say, we think that in the end, to describe much of what we know from science, we have to use mathematics. So any description of quantum fields or general relativity or even evolution and evolutionary dynamics that doesn't use the mathematical language that the scientists use is a falsification, a misrepresentation of our scientific knowledge. So there's not so much the idea that the world is mathematical structures, but rather the language that we use to describe the world is mathematics, and as soon as we abandon mathematics and try and translate it into ordinary language, we're losing much of what we've learned. We're misrepresenting much of what we know.
I want to come back to quantum mechanics in a second, and you're as we're hitching your wagon to that particular start. And just a little digression about the relationship between mathematics and reality, and where you put yourself on this spectrum. One side there is the view that mathematics is just a tool, it's an instrument. In the middle is the idea that the mathematical portrait of the world is the most faithful portrait. And at the extreme end is a sort of industrial strength Pythagoreanism, which says essentially the world is made of numbers, it's made of mathematical objects, like Max Tegmark's The Mathematical Universe view. On that spectrum, you're sort of about the middle, are you?
Yeah, I think our official position is kind of agnostic between the world is mathematical in nature and the world is best described by mathematics.
So
what did it mean to say the world is mathematical in nature? I mean, one thing that's clearly true is that there's a difference between a a causal or law-like structure and a mathematical structure. And I mean, what we're interested in is using mathematics to describe the causal or law-like structure of the world.
Yeah.
I want to give you one example, which isn't a mathematical one from the history of science, to perhaps give a better or a more general explanation of what I mean by ontic structural realism. So the example is the theory of phlogiston, which was the theory of combustion that said that all things that burn have this thing called phlogiston in them, that phlogiston is released on combustion. Now, we no longer think that there's any such thing. It's completely wrong-headed. There's not all things that burn have this thing in common. In fact, we now think that it's not the emission of something, but rather it's the absorption of oxygen. That combustion is oxidation. However, the phlogistonists thought that phlogiston was also contained in all metals, and they worked out that three kinds of process that we observe in the world all around us are really the same kind of process, and that kind of process has a reciprocal kind of process. That is, they worked out that combustion and respiration and the calcination of metals, what we now think of as like rusting or oxidation, are all the same kind of process, and there's a reciprocal kind of process. Now, that knowledge has been retained in modern chemistry.
Oxidation and reduction and so on.
Oxidation and reduction are reciprocal, and all of those three kinds of processes are oxidation, we would now say. They really are the same kind of process. Now, I would describe that as a kind of structural knowledge that's been retained. So it's not just about mathematical structure. The ontology is quite wrong, but there's something very important about the causal structure of the world that they got right.
But now you're extend the notion of structure, because I think a lot of the stuff that's maintained couldn't be called structure. For example, take some of the things that Archimedes discovered. They remain part of totally respectable science.
Indeed, yes.
So it's not a structure that's been transmitted unchanged. It's actually some empirical content.
Yeah, it's only precise, but it's more than empirical content. It's causal, nomological content, right? So that the inverse square law of gravitation is roughly right.
Yeah.
It's not retained exactly in general relativity, but it's a low energy limit. That is more than just an empirical fact. I mean, it's a law-like fact about why the phenomena are as they are. So what I mean by structure is modal structure, and what I mean by that is what we describe when we describe causes and laws.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what you need to posit to take account of the no miracles argument.
The reason I'm pressing on this is because you follow this argument about the transmission of structure.
Yeah.
You end up with an exsanguinated world that is not merely purely quantitative, it's actually structures of quantities in a sort of sense. So that if you take your cue from what is real, from, as it were, what has been handed down by science unchanged structures, as science itself changes, then you end up by draining the world of all sorts of things, including qualities, including consciousness, and Lee Smolin, of course, would argue that you're left with mathematical structure is inevitably frozen, you lose time as well. So by emphasizing what has been structurally conserved in successive theories, or defining what is conserved as structural, you're inevitably led to an idea of the best scientific account of reality being essentially a frozen structure, or a mathematical structure, mathematical desert, a desert of numbers, or of quantities, or of quantities of quantities.
Yes, well, but how desert-like is this structure when one looks at its complexity and richness and the way that it unfolds on so many different levels at so many different scales?
Well, I mean,
it's not desert-like at all, it's incredibly rich. Now, what you might say is, and I mean, I think you put it very well, I mean, lots of people have had this kind of objection, sort of taking out the real content, you're left with this bare formal structure. Where's quality? Where's all of that? Well, I think that insofar as one can say anything objective and communicable about that stuff that's missing, one does it in terms of what you might call structural terms. What's left? Well, some kind of raw feel, brute first person, the redness of the red or whatever. Well, there's sort of two positions you could take on that. You could say, no, actually, if you really understood the full structural description, there'd be nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could regard that as just an incommunicable, undiscussable residue.
But it wouldn't follow.
Either way, it wouldn't be something that needed to play a role in your
Are you
objective
sure?
metaphysics.
I mean, just because it's incommunicable or science can't take hold of it, doesn't mean to say it's ontologically shabby or dubious or second rate. Or indeed that it's not really real in an important sense.
Well, I'm a bit of the whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent.
But we can
Right.
speak of pains and reds and things without it, and we do all the time.
Indeed, but when we do so, we do so in a public language, and we talk about them relationally. So if you were going to really communicate with me about your experience of the red of a particular painting, what would you do? You'd compare it to other reds that were around, right? You'd compare it to feelings. Maybe you'd say it's red like the blast on a trumpet.
But it wouldn't be a quantitative comparison. It'd
No,
probably be
it
saying,
wouldn't be-
gosh,
it
that
wouldn't-
red is rather prettier than the other red.
Maybe
or-
not. No, but I mean, I think quantitative is being imported here for structural. It needn't be. I mean,
Right.
I mean, quantity is ultimately derivative of relation. We actually have no reason to believe that the world has the full structure of the real numbers. I mean, what we do know is that there can be lengths, and we can subdivide those lengths, and we can subdivide those lengths, and so on. But we don't know that there's actually the structure of the continuum there. So we don't know the world has the structure of the real numbers. I mean, what we discern and then we represent using numbers and other mathematical structures is relationships.
So in a sense, your notion of a structure goes not only beyond qualities, but also beyond quantities.
Yes.
It's drained of both. I mean, it brings me to, you've hitched your wagon very much to the current state of quantum mechanics. And yet, as a source of intelligibility, it looks a bit forlorn, because, to quote the sort of pop quotation from Richard Feynman, anybody who thinks they understand quantum mechanics clearly doesn't understand quantum mechanics. And it is intrinsically unintelligible. There are great problems with it, the measurement problem, and solutions to the measurement problem to me seem even more problematic than the problem itself. The Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics to try and wriggle out of the measurement problem is utterly bankrupt scientifically, because multiple universes by definition cannot causally communicate with one another, so there can be no scientific investigation of alternative parallel universes. So it seems a funny wagon to hitch your star to, given that it's in such a conceptual mess at the moment. Is that very unfair?
Quantum theory is the most predictively accurate theory that there's ever been.
That's an instrumentalist response.
Yes, but bearing in mind the no miracles argument, then we think that that kind of predictive accuracy means it's getting at the truth about the world. Now,
It's getting at selective truth.
Hmm?
Getting at a certain selective truth.
Yes.
So the kind of predictions that quantum mechanics make, for example, are absolutely spectacular, but they're only within a certain sphere. The sphere, basically, of quantities, numbers, and so on.
I agree that it's not the last word. I mean, I don't think it's just quantitative. I mean, I think quantum mechanics explains why matter's stable, where classical electrodynamics would say that it shouldn't be. So it's really
But that's
giving us a
recovery.
qualitative understanding of the stability of matter, and is fundamental to there being medium-sized dry goods. I mean, we live in a quantum world.
Yes, we live in a quantum world.
one
It doesn't
way or
feel
another.
like it.
Well, when Wittgenstein said the Earth goes round the sun but it doesn't seem like the Earth goes round the sun. And then
And what would it
the
feel like?
rejoinder was, well, what would it feel like if it did seem like
I know.
it? Well,
So what
it
would
would
it feel
seem
like?
like it is, because
Exactly.
that is how it is. So,
Yeah. I completely concede that point.
Yeah.
Actually. Yes.
thanks very much for your questions, Ray. I very much appreciate them, and the opportunity to give an exposition of what Don and I think. I hope I've done justice to him, and justice to the book, and justice to your attention and interest in it. Thank you.
Well, I've been happily arguing with your book and thoroughly enjoying it for a long time, and it's great to argue with the author as well. So it's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.